Hello and welcome everybody. I am Jackie Zimmerman. I'll be moderating this wonderful roundtable today. I am a longtime UC and JPOUT patient, and I'm really excited for this particular discussion today because it's about research. And that is something that is like so important to me. I'm such a nerd about it, and it's something that should be really important to like everybody in our community. So I'm really grateful for Gali Health for hosting it today. And as a thank you to them, you should totally go download their app and use it because it's a really good tool, but also like they're really good people. Back to research. Okay, we have a stacked lineup of guests today, and instead of trying to explain to you who they are and what they do, I'm hoping that they will do it, but that they'll also brag about themselves a little bit. So like, tell us really like why you're so good at your jobs. So I'd like to start with Katherine.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm Katherine Tynan. I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I am a consultant to clinical diagnostics companies. And I'm a human geneticist by training, so I've been in this space for a long time. And I have been involved in developing a lot of clinical diagnostics throughout the years, everything from infectious diseases to inherited genetic disease testing, and also in the oncology space. So I'm not an IBD expert, but I know a lot about clinical trials and why patients participate and why they don't. And why some are successful and why some are not. So I'm looking forward to sharing those opinions with you.
I am looking forward to picking your brain because my nerd brain wants to learn more in your brain. What about Amber?
Sure. I love how you said long time UC patient. I'm going to totally piggyback off of that. I usually actually give dates, but I feel like maybe I'm not going to do that anymore. So my name is Amber Tresca. I am the person behind About IBD across all social media and my website and my podcast. I'm also one half of the group IBD Moms, along with my friend and frequent traveling partner, Brooke Abbott of the Crazy Creole Mommy Chronicles. And I'm good at my job because I've had the IBD for a really long time. And I live with a J-pouch today after being diagnosed with ulcerative colitis and having medical therapy fail spectacularly. And I have been in the space writing about IBD for a really long time, and we'll say it's been 2 decades. So, and I'm also really looking forward to hearing more from the experts as a patient.
I say long time because normally I'm the old lady in the room, but I will say I know your numbers. You got me beat on the long time part of it.
Unfortunately, yes.
And now I have a new friend, and her name is Arielle, and she works for Gali Health. I'm talking about you before you're talking about yourself. I'm bragging. Now it's your turn.
My name is Arielle Radin. I'm the Director of Clinical Research at Gali Health. I'm also a PhD student in Health Psychology at UCLA. I'm good at my job because before starting my PhD, I actually worked as a clinical research coordinator for an IBD specialist at NYU's medical school for 3 years. And so I was kind of the person running those studies, you know, interfacing with patients, trying to convince them to be a part of our observational longitudinal research studies. I never actually worked in clinical trials, so I'm more on the observational front. But through that whole experience, I became completely passionate about individuals living with IBD, understanding what they're going through both physically and psychologically, and that's what led me to pursue my PhD and work for Gali.
And we're going to talk a lot more about like your role at Gali in a little bit, because there's some really cool stuff happening through Gali in terms of research. But again, I'm ahead of myself. So I want to start like right at the beginning, because there are a lot of different kinds of research. I think most people are familiar with clinical trials as research. And so because the term research can mean a lot of things, for the purposes of this conversation, Katherine, can you explain the differences between like clinical trials and observational research?
Okay, so basically clinical trials come in, I would say, 2 flavors. And effectively what it is interventional and non-interventional. So interventional would be if you're changing a decision on the basis of a trial. So you're changing a medication, or you're changing a behavior, or you're introducing a new medication. So that's sort of interventional. You are altering the course of a disease, and you're taking, there are risks associated with that. Then the non-interventional and observational trials sort of fall into that category as well. So in the non-interventional cases, basically you can just do strict observational, where basically you are a participant, you're giving information, but you're not changing your behavior, or you're not taking a new medication, or you're not using a diagnostic to change the trajectory of your medical management. And in those cases, for non-interventional, you could be asked to give a blood sample, you could be asked to give a stool sample, but effectively, usually what's happening in the non-interventional is you're testing a hypothesis in the context of a standard of care. So you could be a part of a control group, or you could be part of a group that is being asked to give more information. But generally speaking, the risk to you is relatively small, other than, let's say, you might be asked to give a blood sample. And so that's kind of the ways that I think about it. And in terms of the risk that a patient is taking on in participating with clinical trials. Now, there are obviously other risks that are sort of outside of the interventional, non-interventional, but that's kind of how I think about clinical trials in general. Arielle, you might have some additional comments on that.
Yeah, I think like for people from like a patient perspective, if you want to be involved, and I think we'll get into this a bit more, but if you want to be involved in research, but you're kind of afraid to be like a quote unquote guinea pig on trying something out, observational research is a really great way to participate, because you're not actually changing anything about your clinical course. If anything, you're just allowing your experience to contribute to our knowledge of what's happening with IBD, whether that's like trying to predict like, you know, who's going to respond to like Remicade, or, you know, who ends up needing to have a colectomy. Like none of that's really changing what's going to happen to you. It's just allowing the researchers to view what happens to you over time.
So speaking of which, I'm so excited. There is something really awesome happening with Gali Health in terms of research. And I will let you do your job, and Arielle, you can tell us about it.
Yeah, so Gali Health has just launched its first sort of longitudinal observational research study. We're all very excited about it. I think just based on what I've done in the past and what I've been seeing going on in research today, it's very different from other types of observational research studies, mainly because we're approaching this from the standpoint of we want everyone to be able to participate. So what that means is that regardless of who you are, what your IBD experience looks like, if you have a J pouch, if you have an ostomy, if you don't, if you're flaring, if you're not, if you've had the disease for 15 years, if you're newly diagnosed, whatever you are experiencing currently, we would want to observe your experience over time. And on top of that, we don't care where you live. So one thing that's really cool about this is that typically in research studies, you have to live near some kind of academic medical center, or there's kind of like barriers to access because you need to like go to the hospital to have a blood draw, or you need to like go to the physician to have some kind of assessment done. But with Gali, which is this like digital smartphone based application, we can actually observe you digitally over time, regardless of where you're living. And we've also figured out how to collect your stool samples remotely. So we send you everything you need to collect stool and saliva straight to your home, and you can actually have it picked up from your home. So no matter like if you can't leave the house, if you're afraid to leave the house because of COVID, especially, you can still participate in this research. So in terms of logistics, I think it's very different from anything that I've seen being done. The other thing that's really cool about it is that it's personalized. So depending on what you're up for, you could only, let's say that you're like, you know, I don't know about this. I kind of want to test it out a bit, you only have to commit to doing 4 samples over 4 months from the get-go. But if you end up actually being really into it, you're like, you know what, actually, this isn't really that hard for me to participate. We want you to stay involved for as long as you possibly can, potentially up to a year. So I think we're trying to actually do a research study with the human beings who are participating in mind, knowing that like it's already a lot to deal with having a chronic illness on top of living in a pandemic. So we're trying to make this as easy as possible for people to participate so that their unique experiences with the IBD are actually represented in our research studies.
So the millennial in me loves the technology in this. Like, I love that you check in with the app when you've sent stuff and then she talks back to you, and it's fun. I think that's a weird way to put this study, but like
it is
it's
fun.
But also, so as the patient, I'm really excited about it because of the ease of access, like you talked about. But more importantly, you know, as a J-pouch patient, I don't get included in this stuff a lot. And I know, Amber, you probably, I don't know if you've wanted to do studies, but you probably, like, as somebody who's had surgery, that's pretty much a no-go for a lot of studies these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would participate as a longtime UC patient. I remember the days when there was 2 treatments available, and that's why I have to say medical therapy failed, because my medical therapy failed before there was a variety of treatments. So the 2 things that we could do just weren't working anymore. And if I could have gotten into a clinical trial at that point, I would have gone in a heartbeat. Then, of course, once you have surgery, and I'm hoping, you know, the experts can speak to this better, but people who've had different kinds of surgeries may not be eligible to participate in the trials that we think of most often, which are those clinical trials, which is usually that they're trying, which, you know, I guess we say intervention, but for the patient community, it's usually like a new therapy, a new drug. So patients that have had surgery aren't usually eligible for those. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things that when I had surgery, it wasn't something that I really thought about, and it definitely wouldn't have had any bearing on my choices at that time. But it does make it challenging because for a variety of reasons, and one being that J-pouch doesn't cure anything. So you know, if problems do continue, being in a clinical trial, you know, was never available. And so, you know, that's really challenging. And so what I'm interested too in about the footprint study is that what it can say about those of us with J-pouches, hopefully more people who've had surgery for their IBD will take part in this research, because then maybe we can better understand, if we better understand J-pouches and post-surgical patients, maybe that might mean something for, you know, interventional clinical trials, I hope. So this is really wonderful, and I'm really excited.
And Jackie, I just would add one comment to that. I do think that Arielle spoke to this, but it's a really profound change, really, in terms of how clinical trials are conducted. I was just involved in a clinical trial that was run completely virtually, and we recruited, and this was in the colorectal cancer screening space, but we recruited 1,500 patients, received stool samples from them, had colonoscopies done. This was just pre-COVID. Did all the analysis on those stool samples and did that in 6 months. Wow. To do that even 5 years ago would have taken, you know, probably $100 million. Well, let's say it would have taken $50 million. Many academic medical sites being recruited, every individual patient being, you know, individually recruited to the study. The technology for virtual clinical trials has profoundly changed and is changing the dynamics of the patients who can be included. And the kinds of information, the patient reported information that can be collected and validated. And so I think that it's really profoundly changing how we're thinking about research, and hopefully we can get that message out to patients that the ability to be included in this is just the baselines have changed completely.
Well, and for what
will,
sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to add one thing based on what both Katherine and Amber said, is that, you know, ultimately the whole end goal of much of this research, both observational and clinical trials, to find new diagnostics, new prognostics, new therapies, right? And so if there's a huge subset of the population not participating in the research pipeline that results in those new therapies, new diagnostics, it's likely they're not going to work for those people. So it's really important that, like, you know, demographically, clinically, that all of these people are represented in research. Otherwise, all the efforts that are going into this won't really apply to them and they won't get to benefit from it.
And not only that, Arielle, I just want to point out one small thing is that just even getting something approved by your insurance company is a huge barrier. So once you've had surgery, I can only speak from my own experience, but that's what's happened, is that they could say, well, you know, why would you need to continue therapy? You know, and if there's no data, there's nothing to point to and say, well, yeah, but, you know, there was this study and this is why, you know, I need to be on this therapy. You know, that definitely makes it easier. So yeah, I'm so looking forward to these changes in research.
Same. But we have just been joined by our last guest. I'm really excited that you're here, Rob. And if you could just give us a little bit of background on who you are and what you do.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Jackie and the Gali team. My name is Robert Lerrigo. Sorry, I'm a little tardy. I just came back from an emergent case in the OR. But I am a gastroenterologist, and I do consider myself an IBD specialist in the Santa Clara Valley healthcare system based in San Jose. So I've graduated from Stanford's GI fellowship program last year, and starting here, my focus is mainly IBD, but I also have a vested interest in microbiome-related research, fecal microbiota transplants, or fecal stool transplants, as they're commonly known. And I've been in Gali kind of near the beginning. I'm happy to lend my expertise and advice.
Rob, you're speaking my language. Love all the nerd talk.
Fantastic.
So I'm gonna pick your brain here for a minute since you're here with us now. If you know, I'm wondering in terms of IBD research, like Amber was saying a little bit earlier before you got on the call, like how much has changed in the last 10, 20 years,
Yeah.
Do you know, can you explain maybe some of the most important studies or what we've learned, how we have learned the most important things that may have changed the landscape of IBD?
Right. It's IBD is so broad. There's so many different facets, as you know. Anything with chronic diseases, it's very important to approach it from certainly a therapeutic standpoint, a preventative standpoint, but also a very patient-centric standpoint. After all, that's who you're treating. You're treating the patient and the challenges that they face with treatment, whether they feel pain or not, et cetera. Those are all very important considerations. I think the general landscape of research in IBD over the past 10 years or so is really ramping up and geared towards certainly therapeutics, but also more of a personalized medicine approach. So we're really aiming towards precision medicine. By that, I mean we're gradually identifying reliable genetic or laboratory markers that can help us choose which patients benefit from which of the many, many therapies that we now have the ability to offer. Also identifying markers that can predict disease severity moving forward. And I think there's been really wonderful, great push there. But really, in all fields within IBD, there has been a lot of wonderful advancements and continuing, continue to have great work done from a dietary perspective, from a disease monitoring and prevention perspective, even from just a pathophysiology standpoint. Like, what is IBD? What are the true genetics behind it, and why do certain environmental factors influence IBD the way they do? It's always taught that the microbiome, the normal gut bacterial ecosystem, plays an absolutely essential role in the pathophysiology of IBD. And yet most of our therapies don't really target that biology within our colons and the colons of patients with IBD, and that's because it's such a complex field. Most work on the microbiome has really been within the last 5-6 years or so. So I think we're going to make a lot of headway with regard to research involving the microbiome.
I would assume, my assumption based on what I know and who I've talked to is that the microbiome seems to be like the hot topic in research, but also like not just about learning, but like you were talking about precision medicine, like really getting to the core of who we can help with what kinds of therapies. And I think while we're testing that, there's a lot of things to not only be learned, but as patients, like to be gained. And that was one of the things. So I love clinical trials so much, you guys. Like, I spent the last year on an advisory board talking about clinical trials, back to what Katherine was saying, how to make them more accessible, using technology, getting to the right populations. And due to that, I actually joined a clinical trial that I'm on right now for MS, which is something else that I have. But I think the whole process of that, I learned a lot about like what patients can gain from participating in research, which is not just access to therapy, but, intense medical monitoring in a way that you wouldn't have had, or lots of one-on-one appointments that you never really get, like really intense appointments, testing, early access to medication. Anything else you guys want to throw? I just think that there's so much we can gain as patients that it shouldn't be viewed as a scary thing. It should be viewed as an opportunity.
One thing I would say about that.
I think the collective knowledge is the other thing that, you're the folks who are living with these diseases, and I think you're the people who are going to lift up the whole field, right? Because there's a huge dearth of knowledge, right? Given that this is a very prevalent disease, there's a lot of people living with it. Yes, we have some insights into the genetics, and I've only really started looking at a lot of the biomarkers in the field, but there's a lot of work to be done. This is at its heart an immune response disease, and there's interplay between, as we call them in the diagnostics world, analytes that exist in our system, and we just fundamentally don't have good measures of a lot of these biomarkers. There's a lot of very fundamental research that needs to be done. Even getting, the microbiome information to make sense on a longitudinal basis so that it could be used to inform clinical decision making. These are big lifts in terms of just evidence that have to be created. And collectively, I think every person with IBD can benefit the community by contributing to that knowledge base, without, I think, much risk, to themselves. So, and I agree with you. I think the additional care that people get on clinical trials is actually a big win for a lot of people, particularly with chronic diseases.
Yeah, I was going to say, to piggyback off of that, I know that there's a large push in a lot of research areas, including IBD, for community-based participatory research, where the participants are actually active members of the research team, and they're actually providing their insights. And I agree with Katherine wholeheartedly. People who have IBD are experts in the disease, and they have knowledge to share beyond what researchers who do not have IBD would have any idea even in terms of like the questions we should be asking. So that's one thing that I think that the knowledge to be gained from the participants themselves is absolutely crucial. The other thing is that, you know, when I was a research coordinator, I was essentially making sure participants were coming to their appointments, getting their infusions on time. I would run at any kind of like troubleshooting around insurance issues. So you end up getting this like additional advocate essentially who's keeping track of you and making sure that you're getting everything you need, which you otherwise would not have access to. So I think especially when it comes to like young adults who are transitioning from peds to adult care, that's a great time to participate in research because you get this additional help. Yeah, so I think, again, I think the additional support that you end up getting as part of a research trial is huge.
Amber, do you think most patients know this stuff? Because I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of fear, a lot of misconceptions. A lot of people think that you can't participate in research if you're healthy. It's gotta be the last line of defense. Why do you think patients are so hesitant or afraid about any kind of research?
Right. I think there's so many things to unpack there. The first being that I think just our popular culture. Think about like the TV shows that we watch that are about like medical dramas. Okay. What always happens? There's always a physician that comes in and says, guess what? I just got you into this clinical trial. You're not going to die. And it's kind of like, that's how, you know, that's sort of our experience with clinical trials. And that's just not how it goes. And the other thing is that the idea of the guinea pig, you know, that it's some untested, untried thing that you are being asked to put in your body for the good of society, for the good of IBD patients. That's also not true because, of course, by the time it gets to a patient, it's gone through a ridiculous amount of testing. And a lot of times what happens with IBD, I shouldn't say a lot, some of the times what happens with IBD is that there's a drug that's been on the market for a while, and then we figure out that it's good for IBD. So it's actually what they call a secondary indication. So there's a long history of the drug being used, but now it's going to be used in IBD. And if you're involved in that clinical trial, there's already a bunch of safety data behind it and stuff like that. So I think all of these things come together and make patients hesitant. I think another thing is that it's often thought of the placebo trials, and I think I'm not necessarily the person to speak to this on an expert level, but I think there's the idea in the popular culture that it's like you get the drug or you get nothing. And it's my understanding now that that's generally not how it's done. You would still receive care. So what they would call the standard of care. So you would continue to receive maybe what you were already receiving, and then or you would be put on the new therapy. So it's not that you're going to be left with no care, no treatment, and then you're just going to spiral and get worse. Like that's not going to happen. And even if you did start to get worse, they may pull you out of the trial. So there's a lot of different things. Another thing that I became aware of was also when you go to get involved in a clinical trial, is that there's a lot of red tape and legalese and I don't know what the drop-off rate is at that point, but if you're presented with a stack of documents and you have to sign them, and it just I could see some people saying, whoa, this is too much for me, at this point. So before you even get into the trial and you're accepted into the trial, there's all of these things swirling in your head, and that may even prevent someone from even asking about being involved in a trial, because we all go to the doctor, and I think almost everybody probably sees a flyer in the office that says something about a trial. So from the patient standpoint, I think these are just a few of the things that are swirling around and maybe preventing participation.
I totally agree. General education about trials, right? The fact that they're tested on healthy volunteers before they get to you, right? I didn't know that. I thought it was just like, well, we have this thing, we're going to throw it at you. Yeah. And like to your point that, the trial I'm on is in addition to my care, right? I wasn't asked to stop doing anything or come off of a medication. So I think just general trial awareness is pretty pretty low because of what you said. We learned what we learned from the movies, from House, from those very realistic television shows. You know, I think we all have a lot to learn, and that's something that I have taken on as a personal like crusade since I've started learning this stuff, because I think it's so important, especially for healthy people, right? That's part of why we talked a little bit earlier about being bummed as a J-pouch patient that I don't get to participate in a lot of research, because I'm healthy now. I'm in a good spot where I'm happy to participate, and it's not really working out that well for me in that I can't participate in a lot of trials. But yeah, D, all of the above. I agree with everything you just said.
Jackie, though, there was something I wanted to ask you about. Given that you're in a clinical trial for MS, how did that all work in regards to your IBD, and then also being a person with a J-pouch?
So I always feel like I run the chance of skewing the data, right? Just being like, you're the outlier, you ruined everything. But for the most part, so I'm not on any medication for IBD right now, which definitely helps. And because my J-pouch is awesome, I don't really have any recurring IBD issues, but my neurologist is well aware of them. And in terms of, the only thing that becomes weird is like reporting GI issues, where I'm sort of like, this is the norm. You can report it however I guess you need to, but like, this is my norm. It's always going to be like this, as opposed to what my norm is not the norm for everybody else. I think, I don't know behind the scenes how they report some of that stuff, but I know that when you're on a trial, they have to report any symptom that comes up. I was actually on a clinical trial when I got diagnosed with IBD, and they politely kicked me off of that trial because they were like, you are really ruining everything for us right now. Oh. They didn't say that, but I know that's what they meant.
Yeah.
So
too much diarrhea, too much.
Right, pretty much, yeah. So I mean, I think you know, having different diseases that might cross or overlap, I think that's also kind of scary too, right? If I took this medication and it flared up my IBD, like, what do you do? And the good news is that you can always drop off of a study. You know, you can always say, I got to get out. This isn't good for me anymore. Your doctors will help you sort of reassess along the way. And you're getting such heavy medical monitoring that you'll see it early and then be able to either make the choice to continue and maybe alter something or not. And I think that's also super, super important to mention. Pivoting a little bit, Rob, we talked a little bit about the microbiome and how that's sort of like our amazing thing that we're all working towards. Is there anything else happening in IBD that we're in addition to precision medicine? I know we touched on some of this, but there was a study I looked at a couple weeks ago that was talking about, you know, we're testing now that thanks to biologics, a lot of UC patients don't need to have colectomies. You know, like, what else are we really looking for right now?
Yeah. I think, I mean, there's a lot of research going on in a lot of different elements of therapy. There are a lot of new drugs that are potentially going to be available on the market for both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis over the next 5 to 10 years. Every time I go to any national conference or look at an IBD journal, I feel like there's another new drug out there that's, you know, it's still awaiting a name, but it has like a number associated with it or a code associated with it. Me personally, I am really looking forward to the trials that compare different therapies together, because the concern sometimes when you have a flood of drugs out in the market is your gastroenterologist is not going to know which is the great drug for the patient that's sitting right before you. You know, what factors should we consider before starting drug A versus drug B? Is drug A better than drug B in this circumstance or better in other circumstances? I think that is just as important as developing these new drugs. If we don't know how to use them and use them safely, then we run the risk of putting patients through the risks of these drugs without necessarily their benefit, right? You don't want that. So this year alone, there are a lot of great head-to-head trials between different biologics. But I'm looking at my list now of drug-to-drug comparisons, and they run out through 2023, 2024. Like they're just ongoing. I think we're going to see more of those head-to-head. Currently, there are very few head-to-head trials comparing different IBD medications together. We're kind of basing basing our impressions of these medicines comparatively based on comparative analysis studies, basically looking at trials and trying to compare two different trials and joining them together. And sometimes that kind of post hoc analysis isn't incredibly accurate. There's some flaws with that. So having a trial dedicated to just comparing one group to another, I think is important. I just really want to stress everything, Amber and Jackie, that you said about your experiences and about what a placebo really means. I can't stress those enough. And the fears that you've mentioned, Amber, are fears that I have for my patients. I don't want them to feel those things, and it's important to stay informed. And important to that is really maintaining a close relationship with your gastroenterologist or whoever's managing your inflammatory bowel disease. You need to be able to feel comfortable asking those questions. You know, what is a drug trial? What's involved? What if I get put on a placebo arm? What does that mean? And there are some people who are just inherently uncomfortable with being potentially exposed to this drug that's experimental, quote unquote, even if it's been on the market for another indication for a few years. And that's fine. I think there are many different ways of contributing to clinical trials and just IBD research in general without necessarily being exposed to a drug. Now remember, clinical trials involve testing an intervention. That intervention doesn't necessarily have to be a drug. It doesn't have to be an IV infusion. It can be we want to do a randomized controlled trial on this, mobile health app. Does using this mobile health app and monitoring your symptoms reduce the risk of hospitalizations, for example? Right. The main risk of that perhaps would be, the small risk of exposing your personal health information if, the research database was breached or whatever. It wouldn't necessarily be a personal health risk on your part. But really key to any research trial is a good explanation of the risks and benefits. That's very, very important. That's mandated. We have to do that legally. And any human-based trial has to go through a very intensive investigational review board, which makes sure that patients understand all of the risks in undergoing that particular trial.
And I would
go ahead, Katherine.
Thank you, Jackie. I would reiterate what Rob just said. I mean, there's a lot of ways to contribute to research that is non-interventional. And really understanding the biology of this disease will go a long way towards helping make decisions about, your disease activity versus the disease severity. What interventions, particularly for people who are early on in the disease process, really helping them understand what their prognosis is going to look like. There's a lot of those tools that really don't exist as yet for IBD, and they just need fundamental work. And a lot of that will be observational trials with a lot of non-invasive sampling, whether that be stool or blood or saliva, whatever, but really helping people understand at a genetic level, at a sort of biomarker level, what does this patient look like, and what does that say about the stage of their disease, and then how does that help us make clinical decisions about what interventions should be available to those patients.
The other thing that I would mention on that is that just because you're participating in a study that's like looking to see what does the microbiome look like in IBD, when you're contributing your data, both in terms of your experience as well as biological data, that data gets preserved and can be used for like countless other investigations later. So you're not just helping with this one research question, you're potentially helping with like an infinity number of research questions that could potentially be asked in the future, which is especially important right now with all the new technologies that are coming out and new ways that we can look at your data. Like the reason why the microbiome is so hot right now is because of these technological advances that allow us to sequence all of these different, bugs living in your body, which would never have been able to been possible, just a couple of years ago. So I think you're not just contributing to like answering one question. There's questions that have yet to be even thought of that your data could potentially help answer in the future. So it's a huge impact that you can make by just giving one stool sample.
And also I would say that it is as important for people who are healthy or feel like they are not currently in a stressful situation right now. It is as important for them to participate as it is for people who are further along in their disease process, because if you think about it, those are the people we need to help make clinical decisions as they go forward. And if we don't have their data, if we only have the acute end of the spectrum, then we will never create the database that will enable us to facilitate this clinical decision making going forward.
Well, one of the things that kind of really sold me on the footprint study was when I talked to Arielle, and I'm going to paraphrase this, so I'm probably going to get it wrong, was that you were kind of telling me that a program like Footprints kind of helps us look for maybe what could turn into a clinical trial later. So again, if you're afraid of clinical trials, or like they're not your bag, or just it's not your thing, not only are there benefits of the research you're doing, but like you said, like it could go ongoing. Like if you are part of a research program that finds something that turns into a major clinical trial later, like all that pre-research matters. It's valuable. It's really important.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. You did a great job paraphrasing. But no, yeah. So the whole, from my understanding, the whole point of doing these observational studies is to identify these new markers, specifically as it relates to precision medicine efforts, right? So we're trying to identify these new markers, both biologically, so coming from your stool samples, saliva samples, but also what we call digitally, so anything we're collecting in the Gali Health app. And for those of you who have the Gali Health app, you know that we're asking about all kinds of things, not just your symptoms, but we ask you about how stressed you're feeling each day, like how much sleep you're getting, what's your exercise looking like, because we know all of these things are very important for the patient experience. And taking this kind of like integrative, holistic approach, we're hoping that through viewing a combination of these factors over time, we'll be able to identify these new markers, which will hopefully then go into potentially identifying new therapeutics or new ways to predict which types of existing therapeutics would work best for certain types of people. So that's exactly right. Like, even though we're not going to be doing anything to you as part of being a part of the IBD Footprints program, by learning from your experiences, hopefully we'll be able to identify these new markers that will then be used in subsequent clinical trials.
So Rob, with all this like microbiome jazz happening, I saw a couple years ago, there was the first of its kind, I think it was like a study about the efficacy of the Mediterranean diet in IBD. And I'm pretty sure that's what it was. So I know that there's always, people, when you first get diagnosed, somebody's always like, well, did you try XYZ diet, like every time? So I know there's some validity into some of these things, but are we doing more testing in diet? And if we are, is that technically a clinical trial, or would that be more observational?
There are clinical trials involved in diet where people are given a strict diet. Either it's prepackaged or they're advised to, eat more of certain foods and keep a record. Diet trials are very difficult to perform. Diet is a sensitive topic for everyone, right? We often don't know exactly what is in what we're eating. We have cravings for certain foods, and we dislike other foods. If I was part of a clinical trial and it involved eating a ton of cauliflower, I don't know how successful I'd be in completing it. And not only that, but there are other extraneous factors involved as well, related to what the patient's taking in terms of medications, if they're on antibiotics or not, how severe their disease is. So they're very difficult trials, particularly if the benefits are going to be kind of long-term, if you're on this diet long-term for like months, if not years. The microbiome, is heavily dependent on what we eat. And in our society, we get exposed to foods with an inordinate amount of preservatives and foods that are much lower in fiber. I was just telling my fellows, if you were to map out the extent of industrialization of a particular country over time and map out the number of IBD cases in that country, you'll see that they match 1-to-1. So you look at India, for example, as it's gone through its kind of industrialization process over the past several decades, and has grown to become a true industrial economy. You look at the number of IBD cases, boy, they're just tracking along exactly the same way, and a lot of that is due to diet. So to answer your question, yes, diet is exceptionally important. There's not enough data yet for all gastroenterologists everywhere to recommend a particular diet. We generally recommend, eating healthy foods, low in preservatives, foods with a lot of healthy grains in them, natural grains, preferably folks, eating at home, lots of fruits and vegetables. Basically what you think of when you think of a healthy diet. I think as we move forward with personalized medicine, we're going to have a better idea of what our individual microbiome means for us in terms of our own IBD. And we're probably going to have better ways of changing that microbiome for the better. Some of that's going to consist of a very specific diet plan for that specific patient. We're not quite there yet, but we're really making a lot of headway. And all that diet research goes hand in hand with all the microbiome stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would even say because when you were bringing up how people, when you first get diagnosed, everyone's like, well, have you tried this diet or something?
Yeah.
You could think of diet as the same as medication. Just because Remicades working for you does not mean it's going to work for other people. And the same thing with diets, it's so dependent on who you are. There's, I think talking with whoever is, caring for your IBD about any kind of diet that you're interested in trying before doing so, just in case. But again, it's not this one size fits all sort of thing. And that's another reason why it's so hard to study.
And Arielle, that's 100% true. The reason we haven't found a cure for HIV yet is because it keeps on changing on us, and it easily adjusts all the medicines that we have. It's the same thing with IBD. Our own individual personal IBD can change over time. Whereas when we first develop symptoms and we're first starting therapy, our IBD might be acting through one particular inflammatory pathway. Years from now, that may completely change. And so the drugs that worked for us in the past may not necessarily be effective in the future because the disease has changed and is now activating a different inflammatory pathway. So inflammation comes in a lot of different flavors. There's a lot of different pathways. It's not just one thing. But yeah, that's a really important point.
We have a question from a viewer about the Crohn's MAP vaccine. Do you know anything about that, Rob, and how it's coming, if it's coming? What's the word on that?
Crohn's MAP vaccine? No, I haven't heard of that.
I could try to pronounce this for you, but I think I would save us all from that. Allegedly, it's a potential Crohn's disease cure.
I see. I see. So this is the mycobacterium vaccinations. Yeah, there's been, some research in this in the past. I think the link between this vaccination and really its ability to cure a disease that is as diverse as Crohn's disease, it's a very challenging endeavor. Let's put it that way. I think in general, I don't hear much of it when I attend IBD conferences. There's so much heterogeneity within Crohn's disease. It's difficult to claim that any one thing can cure all of Crohn's disease. We'll see. At the end of the game, the proof's in the pudding, right? The proof's in the trials. Medicine has a history of poo-pooing one therapy, and then years later, someone gets a Nobel Prize for that therapy, absolutely working. From a mechanistic standpoint, I know the Mycobacterium avium study, it's still a little bit up in the air in my mind, as to exactly how it's going to achieve what it claims to achieve. But I haven't heard anything new to answer that question.
We have one more question, and that is there currently, or is there any research being planned on or from IBD patients who have recovered from COVID-19?
Yeah, absolutely. So COVID-19 research is the top of most people's minds in the research world now, because one, they either can't, they're having to put their current research prospects on hold while COVID is, and social distancing and all that, but also because, it's obviously impacting the health and lives of our IBD patients as well. So there are registries out there that providers can enter into. One is called Secure IBD, I believe. So that's when gastroenterologists, with your permission, they submit to this database basically a de-identified profile of an IBD patient that has had COVID-19. And the idea is, as we identify more patients with COVID-19 with IBD, we can start looking at any commonalities between them to see if our drugs are increasing risk of an IBD. The IBD drugs are increasing risk of COVID-19, and to adjust our therapies accordingly. We'll probably need more people with IBD to have had IBD, to have had COVID-19 and to have recovered, to really do, to understand more about what that recovery looks like, to be honest. But I know it is an active area of research, and I'm pretty sure in most large academic centers, there's something going on with regard to COVID-19 IBD. So if you're interested in being part of that type of research, if you've had COVID-19 before and you want to be part of that research, it's incredibly informative. I would reach out to really your local academic centers and go from there.
Well, you guys, it's almost that time. I could honestly pick your brains for like another 5 hours. But I want to end on a question that I see all the time, which is, where do we find research opportunities? And I feel like personally, clinical trials are not easy to find, because even if you find them, do you understand what they're looking for? Do you qualify? But observational studies, how do we find them? And anybody can jump in on this one, because I don't know who would know that.
Yeah, that's tough, right? If you want a database of all the clinical trials that are federally funded with your tax dollars, all of them are on a website called clinicaltrials.gov. So clinical trials and .gov is spelled just the way it sounds. You can type in IBD. It'll give you a rundown of where the trial is being carried out and what some of the inclusion/exclusion criteria is and what they're looking for, as well as what stage of the research that that trial is in. For non-clinical trials or studies that are more independently funded, really it's important to reach out to patient advocacy organizations, Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, any online health community related to IBD might be a resource as well. Things like Gali Health even, and a lot of these research trials, not all of them, but a lot of them are carried out at your local academic institution. I realize that a lot of IBD patients aren't nearby to, Stanford or UCSF or whatnot. But if you really truly are interested in being involved in a study, or seeing if you can be involved in a study, you can always go to the websites of these different academic hospitals. Oftentimes they'll have a coordinator or contact person specifically for inflammatory bowel disease, or you see who the head of IBD is, and and shoot their assistant an email. And usually things open up that way. I wish there was a central repository for non-clinical trials for patients, to be a part of or just to peruse, involving all diseases, not just IBD. But I can't think of an easy one off the top of my head. Yeah.
I think the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation has information on that, wouldn't they? And also,
Yeah.
I think if you ask your provider, they probably, even though like your provider might not be participating in research, they have colleagues that they would know about or have met at these these conferences. The other thing I will say is that and Rob, I don't know if you know the exact definition, I don't off the top of my head, but the NIH recently-ish changed their definition of a clinical trial. It's much looser now. So like the way that we think of clinical trials as being like this intervention, now it's actually like pretty much if you do kind of like anything to somebody, it could be considered a clinical trial. So I would, even if you don't want to participate in clinical trials in the way that we think of them, I would still look at the NIH websites to see the list of them, because some of them might actually be way less like invasive than what you think a clinical trial would be. So yeah, I just wanted to plug that because I think it's changed recently.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yes, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation does have a clinical trial finder on their website. I don't have the URL, right on the tip of my tongue, but they definitely do, and it's IBD specific, of course. So it kind of narrows that down for you a little bit if that's what you're looking for. Because I'm an IBD mom, I'm also going to give a plug for an organization called Mother to Baby. So if you are on a pregnancy journey or breastfeeding, mothertobaby.org does a lot of observational studies for moms to be breastfeeding mothers. And I took part in one. I mean, they just call you and ask you some questions. I was actually so excited to be involved in it. So mothertobaby.org, they're doing all kinds of studies, and they're also just a wonderful resource for anyone who is on their journey to start a family for men and women.
The other one that maybe you're in, Amber, maybe you're not, is the IBD Partners through the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation.
Yes.
So that is, I'm just going to read it so I don't botch it. It's an online research network brought to you by the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation and the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. They bring together IBD patients and researchers in a revolutionary partnership aimed at optimizing treatment of IBD, which basically just means they're going to send you a lot of emails about stuff that's happening and maybe ask you some questions, which again is a really non-invasive way to be involved in research and also to stay up on what's happening in research, because that's another thing that I think we've talked a little bit about is if you're not comfortable participating, at least being knowledgeable about what's going on right now, because it likely will affect you and it might inspire you to be involved in the future. Also, it can't hurt to know like what's coming down the pipeline. So whether we're repurposing medications or coming up with something brand new, I don't want to talk about myself too much, but the trial I'm on right now, they're testing something that doesn't exist in the world right now. It's like super revolutionary. And that's so exciting that like I get to know what's happening before most people do, right? That's super cool. So there's so many ways to get involved, whether it's directly or indirectly. There are a lot of patient-driven companies now that will like pay you to answer some questions. That's still research, like that stuff is still important stuff. So I am gonna, again, I love this topic. I could just like talk in exclamation points for the rest of the afternoon about how much I love research, but you have all been very, very helpful, and you all bring such a unique perspective that I think is so a big part of this conversation, right? It's not just doctors, it's not just patients, it's everybody who touches in between, and creating a really amazing partnership between research and patients for better patient outcomes in the end. I think that's what we all want, is better outcomes in the end, better treatments, and better lives. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for being on this call. Thank you to Gali Health for hosting again. Again, go download their app. It's really cool. And if nobody else has anything else to add,
I was just going to say, sign up for the footprint study.
Oh yeah, totally do that.
Oh, so how can people do that though, Arielle?
Yeah. So if you, I believe in the comments, actually, we've posted the landing page, the website for the program.
Cool.
All you have to do is fill out that you're interested. And then you'll likely be getting an email from me to get you signed up with everything that you need. If you already have the Gali Health app, all you have to do is chat to Gali and say, hey, I want to join the IBD Footprints program, or I want to join the study, and she'll get you all taken care of.
Do that too, also. So again, thank you everybody, and have a lovely afternoon. We'll see you later.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Thanks for having
Jackie.
us.